All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And it's another of our All Things Africa edition. And the country we are exploring today is Uganda. So, in our All Things Uganda edition, looking at the history and current affairs of this large Central African country, who bear to teach us about this country than our returning champion, Abayomi Azikiwe, the founder and editor-in-chief of Pan-African Newswire, where he himself is a regular contributor. He's also a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports and a regular guest and columnist on Global Research, NewsHour, globalresearch.ca, CGTN, Press TV, and other left-leaning anti-imperialist publications. So first off, Abayomi, welcome back to the program, and it's always an honor to have you.
Well, thank you so much for the ongoing interest in the work that we're doing.
Likewise, and just before we get started, as always, don't forget, folks, please share widely One Plus One's works, both old and new episodes, in our playlist, and help us overcome not only the far-right algorithms, but the still dominant corporate media and Western state media that has an unjust advantage of the algorithm. So anytime you share One Plus One, you're helping a great deal, and please donate to One Plus One. We're entirely independent media, so do donate generously if you can, or however much you can. It's all greatly appreciated. And now, on to the topic at hand, because I have so many questions about this country. So, Abayomi, as always, let's start at the very beginning. What was Uganda like before both German colonization? Because you mentioned when you were teaching us about Tanzania that Uganda was part of a German colonial project. So what was Uganda like before both German colonization and British colonization? And I guess my only follow-up question for this first one is, what distinguished German colonization from what became British colonization, particularly of Uganda?
Well, Uganda, as it has become, as it became under German and British influence, is a landlocked country. And was marked beginning in the 13th century by the rise of the Buganda kingdoms. And the Kabaka, who was the chief of the Buganda, was more or less the head of state. And it was a huge kingdom. It dominated that region of East Africa. And also prior to that, of course, there were other city-states in the region. And what we have to understand is that the origins of humanity and human civilization come from the East Africa region. So it dates back even millions and millions of years in terms of human habitation. And there are, of course, archaeological finds that have proved this over the last several decades. So, as you've mentioned, the British came in competition with the Germans and other colonial powers. And of course, there was a British protectorate that was set up around the turn of the late 19th and early 20th century. What you had was a form of indirect rule, which the British had done in other parts of Africa. You had the Kabaka, you had that monarchy making an arrangement with the British colonial authorities, so they would be able to stay in power at the same time, paying tribute to the British colonialists and imperialists. And this went on for decades and decades. Also, the missionaries came in as well. There was already a Muslim influence in Uganda in terms of the influence of Zanzibar, which spread Islam in various parts of East Africa. Then, of course, you had in the 1880s, 1890s, the influx of missionaries, Christian missionaries. Mm-hmm. They were both Catholic as well as Protestants. So you had the Catholics, you had the Protestants, as well as the Muslims. And there was conflict between these groups. but it was aggravated even more after the onslaught of British colonialism.
Okay.
So when the British authorities came in and set up a protectorate around 1900, they went on to control the country for another 6 decades. And during that time period, of course, there was struggle, internal struggle between the various religious groups in the country, and also the extraction of profit from the coffee and cotton industries in Uganda. So they of course, became a victim, just like many other parts of Africa, in regard to colonialism and imperialism. But that is really the basis of the current conflict that took place in Uganda during the 20th century as well as the 21st century. So that's just a brief snapshot of Ugandan history between the time of the Kabaka kingdoms right on up to the advent of German and later British imperialism. And then, of course, the adoption of a Uganda protectorate around 1900. And then, of course, that went on for 6 decades. The country became independent in 1962. And that should be a whole nother chapter of the country.
And actually, just before we talk about Ugandan independence, talk to us a bit more about British colonialism and what were some of the grotesque institutional racism and racial capitalism that the British imposed on the Ugandan people. And then my only follow-up question to that is, what are some of the legacies of British colonialism that Uganda still struggles to overcome at this very day?
They established what was known as the Imperial British East Africa Company. Okay, and the first word says it all. Says it all. It was an imperialist system of forced labor, taxation, land confiscation, and of course the development of a cash crop economy, and that of course led to the impoverishment of people in Uganda. Now, when the protectorate was set up, it was largely centered around the Buganda people in Uganda. But then it expanded to encompass other ethnic groups in the country that became known as Uganda. So it was a large-scale exploitation process, and that continued for a number of years. But the Imperial British East Africa Company also fostered divisions among the African people there, to the point that even some of the British agents advocated for the adoption of a direct colonial system, not allowing the corporation, the Imperial British East Africa Company, to have total control. What they wanted was a British colonial authority to come in. So they eventually negotiated a protectorate agreement, which allowed some of the monarchs to maintain their authority and influence over the rank and file in the country, particularly among the Buganda. But at the same time, they had to pledge allegiance to the British crown. So these people were more or less like intermediaries between the African masses and the British colonial authorities. So that's what the protectorate actually was. During the late 19th, with the British Imperial Company in the late 19th century, and then, of course, after 1900 with the Uganda Protectorate. So it was a system of indirect rule, and that's how it proceeded. Now, it created some serious problems. For example, the massacre of Christian and Protestant adherents in Uganda. And of course, that brought about the whole notion of the martyrs of Uganda, which was recognized by the Catholic Church. There were parishes. In fact, in Detroit, there was a parish here. It's closed now, known as the Martyrs of Uganda. That was an attempt to not only bring sympathy to the converts of traditional African religion or Islam to Catholicism, but it also created a situation where people would be sympathetic to the Catholic Church, but at the same time, it was a method of somewhat Africanizing Catholicism within an African context. So it's kind of misleading in a sense because, the Catholic religion was part and parcel of the exploitative system that existed in Uganda. These people were killed, which was tragic, but they utilized the martyrdom of these Christians to, in fact, promote Catholicism and also to raise the notion that Africans, too, were victims of those who were against Christianity on the continent. So it's somewhat of a complicated situation, but this is how it developed during the early part of the 20th century.
So very quickly, just to clarify something, for our audience who might be ignorant of this. So there was a horrific massacre of Black Ugandan Catholics, but the colonial authorities used that as a way of actually saying, this is why we actually need to be more vicious and much more confrontational and much more aggressive in our colonialism in Uganda and whatever part of Africa Britain colonized then.
Right.
Okay.
They utilized religion as well as force of arms and economic exploitation to carry out the colonial project. So yes, it was all part and parcel of the same method, even though the missionaries claimed that they were concerned about the spread of Christianity and that they wanted to improve the conditions of the people inside the country. They collaborated with the British colonial authorities. So they had somewhat different interests, but at the same time, overall, they were for European colonial domination.
Exactly. And actually, that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is, talk to us about Uganda's first democratically elected government of Milton Obote. And I understand, just like Kenya, when Kenya got its independence, there was a lot of violence and a lot of a lot of violent upheaval before Britain reluctantly decided to give Uganda its independence. So talk to us about Uganda's first democratically elected government of Milton Obote. Was he a leftist? And if so, how much was he? What did he try to accomplish when he was when he was the leader of Uganda? And which if and hold on, man. Sorry about that. Actually, okay. Let me restart this question. So talk to us about. Sorry about that. So talk to us about Uganda's first democratically elected government of Milton Obote. Was he a leftist? And if so, how much? What was he trying to accomplish when he was the leader of Uganda that would overnight help the mass poor in Uganda? And my only follow-up question is, what was Obote's short-lived legacy? And feel free to share any criticisms you might have of him, because I understand, from what I understand, I saw a documentary about Idi Amin, which we're going to talk about later, and it depicted Obote as very autocratic, which didn't help his image when he was cooed by Idi Amin. But at the moment, so please do respond to all those questions about Milton Obote.
Okay, well, actually, the first prime minister of Uganda was a man by the name of Benedicto Kiwanuka. And he was only prime minister for a few months. And in fact, it was under his leadership that the British turned over control of Uganda to the people. And that only lasted a few months. Then a few months later, in the spring of 1962, Milton Obote became the prime minister of Uganda. And his group was called the Ugandan People's Congress. And he, of course, had problems because of divisions within the Ugandan political landscape. He also, later, after 1966, when he was reelected, moved to the left. And he proclaimed, he was a socialist, a Pan-Africanist, and he had very close ties with Dr. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana.
Interesting.
Even after Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown in February of 1966, and relocated in Guinea, Conakry, he maintained close ties with Kwame Nkrumah. In fact, Kwame Nkrumah's magazine, which was Nkrumah's magazine, had an office in Kampala, Uganda, as well as in London.
Interesting. I did not know
Yes.
that. Fascinating.
Yeah. Many people consider Obote and Nkrumah's. So it really complicates things because later on, in 1971, when he was overthrown by Idi Amin, it's interesting that Idi Amin initially was supported by Britain as well as the state of Israel in the overthrow against Obote. So that's a very interesting beginning to this whole chapter of Ugandan history. Of course, that changed very quickly, particularly the year after 1972.
So what were so what were some of the left policies Milton Obote was trying to accomplish, which would have helped the mass poor of Ugandans, and which of course was later sabotaged because he was overthrown in that Anglo-Canadian Israeli backed coup of Idi Amin.
Yeah, I think that he had very close ties with Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, and they had a similar approach to domestic politics, working towards nationalization of key industries inside the country, discussion of socialism, but socialism as they interpreted it within an African context. So yeah, that was the similarities between Tanzania and Uganda. And they were very close, Julius Nyerere and Milton Obote. And of course, that came out much later after the coup d'etat that Amin carried out, the colonel, in 1971. But yes, a lot of people opposed that coup, even people on the left in the United States at that time, because of the image that Milton Obote had vis-a-vis his promotion of Pan-Africanism and socialism. But that became a major source of debate after the 1971 coup in Uganda.
And is there any truth that he was that he was somewhat autocratic in his approach in trying to accomplish these much needed socialist policies for Africa, and because of some of his actions, which some people deemed, autocratic, it didn't help his image when he was, eventually, couped. I'm curious your response to that.
Yes, you have to understand that you still had the Buganda kingdom that was considered, the largest group inside the country, and many people within that group felt as if the independence of Uganda should have been turned over to them, as opposed to secular political parties. That was one issue. Then, of course, you had the regional conflict between the Akoli and other groups, including the Buganda, inside of Uganda itself. So, yes, there were conflicts, political conflicts, clashes between various political parties inside of Uganda. And that was true of many of the post-colonial African states. And, of course, tribal affiliation did play a role in this whole process, as well as different views on how the country should proceed in terms of its alliances with other African states. So it became a very complicated situation, particularly after the independence in 1962 and the two administrations of Mr. Milton Obote.
Fascinating. Idi Amin. Talk to us about the legacy of Idi Amin, or Big Daddy, as he wanted some people to call him. And when you talked about when you talk to us about Idi Amin, please explain how the West, notably Britain, Canada, the U.S., Israel, and even the Gulf states, notably Saudi Arabia, helped Amin get into power and were complicit in his reign of terror that he unleashed on his own people. And which major industries from which Western countries benefited from Amin's rule?
Well, I would think that the Muslims, for example, and the Arabs had already been in that region for many years, for centuries. largely based in Zanzibar. And a lot of the people that went there were the Omani Arabs from West Asia. And they, in fact, engaged in agricultural trade as well as human trafficking. So,
Wow.
Amin, he, as you mentioned, was involved in a military coup d'etat against Obote, and he took control of the country in 1971. The coup was very controversial. People denounced it. Tanzania, in particular, was very much against it, and as a result of that, he became the relations between Tanzania and Uganda became very strained, and they remained that way all the way up until 1979, when Idi Amin was eventually overthrown. But Amin had requested, because of the tension between Tanzania and Uganda, he had requested military equipment from both Britain and the state of Israel to engage in some type of military operation against Tanzania because of a border dispute inside the country, inside the region. The Israelis and the British refused to supply this heavy-duty military equipment. And as a result of that, Amin became very angry. He broke diplomatic relations with Britain as well as Israel.
And is that when he and is that when he started to call himself the last king of Scotland, the last person to resist British imperialism? Very interesting that he would refer to Scotland. I'm a supporter of Scottish independence, which is a whole other topic for another day. But is that why? Right. But is that why he? Yeah.
It could have been. It could have been his rationale, but he looked at himself as, quote, the Lion of Africa, someone who was standing up for even African unity, for being against colonialism. And as I mentioned, he fell out with the British and the Israelis. And then he opened up diplomatic relations with Libya, then under Colonel Gaddafi, as well as the Palestine Liberation Organization. So they wound up sending people to Uganda, and that became a problem, for the British, as well as the United States and Israel. So this went on for a number of years. And of course, the hijacking incident in 1976 at Entebbe, which had been the capital under colonialism, and that worsened the situation between Uganda and the state of Israel, Britain, as well as the United States. But that incident where the Israeli commandos came in to rescue, so to speak, the captives at Entebbe, and it resulted in a number of deaths on both sides, including, from what I understand, the brother of Benjamin Netanyahu, who was killed in that raid in 1976, who was part of the Israeli Defense Forces. So the situation deteriorated during that period. But yes, there were executions that took place. One of the key people in the Ugandan Supreme Court supposedly was taken and at gunpoint and eventually executed while he was in prison, purportedly by Amin personally. I don't know if that's the case or not, but there were reports that thousands of people lost their lives during his reign in Uganda. But at the same time, what was interesting about this whole process is that at that time, Libya, the PLO had very close ties with the Amin regime. So it became a source of debate, even in this country, among Pan-Africanists and leftists during the 1970s.
Fascinating, and the debates on whether Idi Amin was a reliable actor, sort of like Ali Selassie.
Yes, and that was a problem. Like for example, the late Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, was in Uganda a lot during that period. I think he was even issued a Ugandan passport diplomatic passport. But at the same time, he got a lot of criticism from other forces in this country and internationally for his staunch defense of the Ugandan government under Idi Amin. So you had different forces that took different positions around Amin. So it became very complicated during the post-coup period of 1971.
Interesting. And can you talk about Idi Amin's expulsion of South Asian Ugandans, who he accused of having an unfair advantage in owning most of the medium to small sized businesses like local food markets, night shops, 7-Eleven type stores? Was there some truth to this? Was this a legitimate grievance, but his xenophobic expulsion was the wrong way to go about it? And when I learned about Uganda from my 10th grade history teacher, and we were covering covering different African countries, my friend at the time, Mr. Klinger, he once said that one sad aspect about Ugandan colonial rule and even Idi Amin's legacy when he was ousted was many of the South Asian families and were of a middle class background who some of them when they returned to Uganda after Idi Amin was overthrown, many of them got their businesses back, and still he says to this day it's mostly South Asians who own many foods, mini markets, food shops, convenience stores, gas shops, 7-Eleven type stores, whereas most Black indigenous Ugandans live with less than $1 a day, less than £1 a day. And so many Ugandans tend to harbor very similar attitudes Black Americans feel about Korean immigrants, South Asian immigrants, and anyone else that they feel has an unfair advantage in controlling most of the local businesses, which they think that them and Latinx folks should be the ones running these small businesses and spreading wealth in South Central Los Angeles and similar large Black impoverished communities. So, how are South Asian and Black Ugandan relations and power dynamics back then and now when we talk about Uganda?
Well, there were 32,000 East Indian migrants that were brought into Uganda to work on the railroads, and they were brought in as workers. They were brought in as people who were exploited viciously. And after the railroads were built, many of them returned to India, but approximately 6,000 remained in Uganda. And as you said, some of them did go into these small businesses, intermediary businesses, import, export trade, and some of them did become quite wealthy, and they set themselves apart from the African masses. And of course, this created a lot of hostility, not just in Uganda, but also you had similar situation in Kenya as well as Tanzania. You have East Indian populations there as well. So in, I believe it was 1972, you were talking about when they were expropriated and exiled. Many of them also carried British passports along with Ugandan passports. So their businesses were taken, and a lot of them were brutalized, and they fled the country. Some of them were, became prominent figures in many ways. But even on the left, for example, people like Yash Tandon and others who were, political scientists, theoreticians, academics, and so forth.
Yeah, in Britain, one of the worst examples of a South Asian Ugandan immigrant that made it big was Priti Patel, who's a very well-known hard right Tory MP
in the U.S.
In the UK. So yeah.
Yeah, the Patel. Yeah, he was made head of the FBI and the ATF. I understand he was fired as director of the ATF. I don't know about the others, but anyway, we'll see what happens. There's so much chaos right now in the U.S. That's a whole different different discussion. But yes, those people were thousands and thousands of them were, had to flee Uganda. A lot of them went to Britain. were there. They opened businesses as well. So yeah, it was a big problem. And he turned over a lot of the businesses to people in Uganda, but apparently they did not have the expertise or the contacts to run them as efficiently as the East Indian population had done. So that was another aspect of his rule that really shed a lot of negative light on Uganda under the Idi Amin government. But that happened. No one could deny that these things happened. And of course, that was criticized as well among elements of the left and even some Pan-Africanists because they felt that he should have gone after the British capitalists who were operating inside the country as opposed to those people from India who were more like the middle class, upper middle class strata that dealt a lot with commercial interactions in Uganda and their trade with external powers.
Exactly. And what happened with Amin's relations? You already sort of talked about it, but let's talk a bit more about it. So, what happened with Amin's relation, particularly with Britain and Israel, that caused its friendly relationship with the West, which was Western governments often looking the other way at his obscenely violent suppression of all opposition? And credit where it's due. Many major corporate states, media, both print and broadcast, did report a lot on Amin's reign of terror. But funnily enough, very few talked about how it was Western support for Idi Amin that was vital in his violent rise to power. So,
Exactly.
so I'm curious, what did Amin do that caused his marriage with the West to go sour, and sour to the point that the Western press would print stories where you don't know if they were half truth or just fake news because this one mob goon gets uppity, and now the mob bosses have to make an example out of him and undermine him, and then they're okay with him being ousted. So I'm curious. I'm curious your response on that. And I'll just quickly add, one of the allegations was that Idi Amin, engaged in cannibalism, and stuff like that. But we actually don't know if this is full on fake news or if there is some truth to that. But I'm curious your response.
Yeah, I think really turned him against the West. I mentioned earlier his request for fighter jets and sophisticated military equipment after he came to power, and that was designed to fight against Tanzania, which was mobilizing opposition against him for military intervention. Even as early as 1972, there was an attempt at a military intervention by Obote, and even Yoweri Museveni joined in with Obote, even though they were rivals. Even as early as those early years in the 1970s, they actually tried to conduct a invasion into Uganda to overthrow Amin and to reinstate Obote. Now, it failed in 1972, and it was condemned, in fact, even by the Organization of African Unity and several other countries, that Tanzania should not invade Uganda to overthrow the government. Now, Nyerere had denied that Tanzania was behind this effort, but in all likelihood, and it's definite evidence now that he was very much aware of it and had supported it.
Interesting.
So these opposition forces remained in Tanzania from 1972 all the way to 1979. And as you mentioned, the reports about what was going on in Uganda became even worse as the years proceeded. We talked about the intervention of the Libyans and the Palestinians during that particular time period. But at the same time, a lot of Ugandans were complaining that they were being arbitrarily harassed, arrested, exiled, imprisoned, and even executed inside the country. And as you said, the West, they were angry because he had turned against the Israelis, he had turned against the British, and he had invited the Libyans and the Palestinians in. So that's why they were very, very angry with Idi Amin. So a lot of those news reports could have very well been exaggerated, grossly exaggerated during that particular time period. But Amin was projecting himself as part of the anti-imperialist, Pan-Africanist current internationally. And he even floated the whole idea of forming an army to invade apartheid South Africa, and that really didn't go anywhere. But this is the type of rhetoric he was promoting at that time to build confidence and support among the African masses, even though there were a number of governments that were against him during that time period, particularly the United Republic of Tanzania. So remember in 76, you had the student uprising in South Africa, which got a lot of international attention. It spawned a new wave of the anti-apartheid movement, Southern African Solidarity Movement. In 76, remember, Zimbabwe was still fighting ZANU PF and ZIPRA PF and ZANU and ZANU PF and ZAPU PF. And then also in Namibia, there was extensive fighting that was going on. Angola, you had the independence in November of 1975, but then there was a huge war where the South African Defense Forces, the CIA backed an invasion by the UNITA organization, a fake liberation movement that had been supported by Portugal during their reign there. And then after the MPLA was able to take over Luanda in 1975, they invaded, backed by the South African Defense Forces and the United States, an invasion that was defeated in the early months of 1976. So this gives you a picture of what was going on overall in Africa during that particular time period. So Amin, in his effort to build public support and praise, offered to form an army to go in and fight the South Africans on their own soil. But none of the liberation movements, well, at least the ANC did not support that. Neither did SWAPO and other forces support that notion as well. They felt that they had to liberate their territories themselves, and his rhetoric, they felt in many ways was not helpful to the cause of national liberation.
Interesting. And that's very fascinating and funny. You actually don't even know about this this side of Idi Amin, so that's quite fascinating.
Yeah, but a lot of people just considered it rhetoric, demagoguery, because they were accusing him of persecuting his own people, having overthrown a socialist-oriented administration of Milton Obote, and having been installed with the assistance of the Israeli intelligence and the British Foreign Office. So a lot of people didn't take that seriously, that he was sincere in his commitment to fight apartheid, to fight Western influence in Africa, and being in solidarity with the Palestinians and other revolutionary forces in the Arab world.
And when you were last on 1+1, and we explored the history of Tanzania, and I think Tanzania did a service to African and global humanity by overthrowing Amin in the Ugandan-Tanzanian War, or the Border War, as it's sometimes called. So, what circumstances led to Tanzania, which often has very peaceful relations with its neighboring countries and all of Africa, to them defending what they claim was their sovereignty, and not just winning a war, but ousting Idi Amin and freeing Ugandans from him, in very much the same vein as when Vietnam invaded Cambodia and liberated the people from the Western-backed genocidal and murderous sociopath backward Pol Pots in the Khmer Rouge. Was that very similar dynamics when Tanzania invaded Uganda and overthrew Idi Amin?
Well, this is interesting because these developments were taking place at the same time in terms of what was happening in Kampuchea, as it was known at that time, and the intervention by Vietnam to overthrow the Khmer Rouge, and then, of course, the Chinese intervention in Vietnam after Deng Xiaoping had visited the United States to normalize relations in January of 1979 under Jimmy Carter. But in Uganda, of course, there was an intervention by the Ugandan Defense Forces in Tanzania. And of course, in response to that, the Tanzanian People's Defense Forces, along with the opposition groups, the armed opposition groups from Uganda, intervened in the country over a period of several months. And the Amin government at that time collapsed, totally collapsed. And of course, he fled Uganda, eventually wound up in Saudi Arabia, where he remained until the time of his death.
And apparently, sorry to interrupt, but apparently he was asked off the record by a journalist who said to him, "How do you look back on your, on your time in office and all the allegations that you were a murderous dictator and a cannibal and so forth?" And apparently, Amin said the following: "I look back with nostalgia." So,
wow, amazing.
Facts.
That is amazing. But yeah, he was overthrown in 1979. And even though he was overthrown, there were still problems in regard to bringing Milton Obote back. He eventually did take office in 1980 again. And he stayed in office for 5 years, but there was so much turmoil and instability that eventually he was brought down, and the so-called National Resistance Army under Yoweri Museveni, who had also, I mentioned earlier, was in Tanzania. He attended the University of Dar es Salaam with a lot of the other forces that were notable at the time. He was there during the period when Walter Rodney from Guyana had taught at the University of Dar es Salaam, and others. So Museveni in 1986 was able to take control of Uganda again, and he's been president there since 1986. You're talking about 39 years. We've had one head of state in Uganda.
When Milton Obote came back to power, what did he do, which yet again caused the West to back his ouster in the Ugandan civil war? And from there, you've already talked to us about the rise of one of the biggest Western-backed imperialist goons, neo-colonialist goons, bootlickers, not just in Uganda, but also Rwanda and Congo, and that is Yoweri Museveni. So what did Milton Obote do that once again the West said, we have to oust this guy and replace him with our guy?
Well, Museveni, for example, had collaborated with Milton Obote during their period in exile in Tanzania, even though they were rivals and really didn't like each other. And so when Milton Obote came to power and the situation still was not stabilized in Uganda, the economic situation continued to deteriorate, Museveni saw it as an opportunity to come in with his military forces to oust the existing government at that time in 1986. So when Museveni came in the first few years, he made appeals to the International Monetary Fund and other financial institutions and agreed to a structural adjustment program. I think it was known at that time as the Economic Recovery Program, along with Ghana and West Africa. And they went further than any other state in Africa in regard to accepting this restructuring program. Remember, this is the 1980s. Africa was suffering immensely as a result of the policies of International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other financial institutions. A lot of people fled the continent because they could not make a living there. Others who were still there, working in the public sector, for example, were making almost no wages during this period, because one aspect of the structural adjustment program was a devaluation of currency, also the elimination of large numbers of civil servants, educational employees, and also the reduction of their salaries. So it caused a lot of hardship and a lot of problems in Uganda, as well as other parts of Africa during the 1980s. But nonetheless, he was able to stay in office, to stabilize the country, and we saw what happened in 1994 when the genocide took place in Rwanda, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed. Now, Paul Kagame had been a part of the National Resistance Army of Museveni. In fact, had some rank there. So he had very close ties at that time with the Ugandan military under Museveni. So when he overthrew the government in Rwanda this was around June of 1994, they were very close allies, Uganda and Rwanda. And they were both, particularly Uganda, very closely allied with the West. Now, even though the United States refused to declare what had taken place in Rwanda between April and June of 1994 as a genocide, they did step in with a lot of assistance and diplomatic support for the Rwandan Patriotic Front government. So for years after that period, Rwanda and Uganda had supported and had participated in a lot of military operations which were in line with U.S. Imperialist foreign policy in Africa. Now, we could talk about those. There are a number of them.
No, definitely. But... Well, you already answered this question, which is how do you assess Yoweri Museveni's socio-economic fronts at home in Uganda, and that's one of basically endless austerity and doing the bidding of the IMF and the World Bank. And you've already talked to us about his very reactionary and pro-Western imperialism agenda when it comes to Rwanda, and of course, and of course, the reign of terror that Paul Kagame has unleashed on his people in Rwanda with the RPF. In fact, there's more and more evidence, coming out that it was actually the RPF itself that shot the planes of the president of both Rwanda and Burundi at the time, and that the RPF was actually involved in a lot of the mass slaughters, along with Rwame, but it was the RPF itself of Paul Kagame that instigated that, and later unleashed a reign of terror in Congo, overthrowing Mobutu, installing their own proxy. So Yoweri Museveni and Paul Kagame, with the Western backing, installed Laurent Kabila, and when he said to the Rwandans, "Okay, I'm leader now of Congo. You guys need to go back to your country," poof, he was assassinated, and his son, Joseph Kabila, who basically was a puppet of both Rwanda and and the West at large, happens. So, is that a fair assessment when we talk about Yoweri Museveni's reactionary role in both Rwanda and also Congo Zaire, Congo formerly Zaire, but Democratic Republic of Congo?
I think it's very complicated. On the one hand, for example, Mobutu Sese Seko was a puppet of the imperialists for decades.
Exactly.
And he had been a butcher. He had slaughtered a lot of people. He had even, in fact, worked to try to undermine the independence and unity of Angola. Holden Roberto, who was head of the FNLA, that was one of the so-called liberation movements in Angola, had been married to Mobutu's sister, from my understanding. He was a brother-in-law of Mobutu. Now, they had sent troops in to try to fight the MPLA in the early phase of independence, and they were defeated, roundly defeated. And then, of course, Mobutu himself continued to plunder resources and to work very closely with the imperialists. There were numerous attempts to overthrow him. 1965, of course, that involved Che Guevara and Laurent Kabila, who was a part of the anti-Mobutu forces. Kabila had fought with the Lumumbas during the early 1960s. He had a group called the Congolese Congolese People's Revolutionary Party.
Interesting. I did not know that about Kabila, about Daddy Kabila. Interesting.
Yeah, but the thing is that when he took over after the collapse of the Mobutu government in 1997, as you mentioned, the Rwandans and the Ugandans, as well as people in the West too. Angola, for example, had participated in the project to overthrow Mobutu because they were longtime enemies. However, as you mentioned, once that the Kabilas, the AFDL, Alliance of Democratic Forces for Liberation, took control of the government in Kinshasa, there were problems with both Uganda and Rwanda. And in August of 1998, the Rwandans under Paul Kagame and Uganda under Yoweri Museveni, along with AFDL people who were Congolese, invaded the Eastern DRC. And this led to a 5-year protracted war that people describe as Africa's World War. It pitted Uganda and Rwanda against the Southern African Development Community military forces. At that time, in 98, Zimbabwe under Mugabe was heading the military secretariat of SADC. And it was Zimbabwe, Angola, and Namibia, and later Burundi that came in and actually salvaged the Laurent Kabila government, as you mentioned, for the first 3 years. And then Laurent Kabila was killed, assassinated in 2001.
Yeah.
His son, Joseph, took over after that. But in 2003, there was a negotiated settlement to the war, and it did a lot of damage. It's reports that millions of people were killed, but that too split, a lot of the anti-imperialist and Pan-Africanist forces. A lot of people supported the Southern African Development Community during that particular time period. They viewed the governments in Uganda and Rwanda as Western puppets and surrogates, and that it was good that they were stopped in their attempt to take over the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is rich in strategic and rare metals and minerals. So yes, it was a very, very bad situation that developed between 1998 and 2003. There were huge amounts of dislocation, migration between Rwanda and the Eastern DRC.
And still very much ongoing.
Yeah.
Both Rwanda and Uganda still have proxies in Congo itself, in the Eastern Kivu region, where they're basically plundering it of all of its mineral resources and then selling them at very dodgy prices to whomever, including to whomever in the West, but including the Chinese as well, and which is also quite complicated.
Now you mentioned the Ituri province. That's where the Ugandans just recently, I understand, had a military incursion there because of the instability in North Kivu and South Kivu, where the M23 rebels have come in and essentially taken over, it appears, at least the two capital cities of Goma and Bukavu. But the situation there still remains unsettled because there were negotiations just this past week between Felix Tshisekedi and the government in Rwanda. I don't know how that's going to turn out, but obviously the DRC government is in very, very difficult situation right now. Looks like the military apparatus collapsed in both of those key strategic provinces in the East. So it still remains to be seen what's going to happen in the DRC. But Uganda, of course, they feel they have interests in maintaining their interests in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we'll have to see what happens in that regard. But going back to Uganda, under Museveni, there has been, of course, large-scale findings of oil in Uganda, largely offshore. And they have set up their own oil corporation inside the country. It appears as if the national income of the country has rose over the last decade or so. And also, Uganda in recent years tends to take a more anti-Western stance. Now, how genuine this is remains to be seen. For example, right now they're heading the non-aligned movement. They had a summit there last year. A lot of anti-Western, anti-imperialist statements and resolutions were passed, but who knows how this is going to pan out eventually. They also hosted the Group of 77 plus China, which represents about 70–80% of the world's population. So Uganda now tries to project an image of being anti-Western,
Yes.
saying that, well, the West can't tell us what to do. We have to maintain our own policies, domestic and international. So it's really interesting what has happened, because if you look at, for example, Somalia, what happened in Somalia during the first decade of this century, when first the Ethiopians under Meles Zenawi intervened there to stop the Islamic Courts Union. We talked about this in a previous broadcast.
Yeah.
Uganda went in and as well to support what was perceived and was a pro-US, a pro-British position in Somalia. They constituted the AMISOM, the African Mission, African Union Mission in Somalia. So it's a very contradictory situation. On the one hand, you have Uganda during its early phase under Museveni between 1986 up until about a decade and a half ago, being very pro-Western, participating in Western engineered military interventions in the region. But then over the last several years, having taken a position of somewhat nationalistic position and somewhat of an anti-imperialist position. But we'll see what actually happens in this coming period.
Fascinating. And I have to ask this question, which is, who was or is Joseph Kony and the Lord's Resistance Army? And what's the actual truth about him and his actions? And what's in the two documentaries about Joseph Kony, Invisible Children, which I saw when I was a high school student, and also Kony 2012, which I saw when I was a university student in Brussels. And what's your assessment of both documentaries? I don't know if you've seen them, but if you have, I'm curious your response before I give my critical assessment of the both, of those two documentaries.
I have not seen them, but I believe that the Lord's Resistance Army is not a progressive organization. That it was largely based upon superstition, and they were doing carrying out a lot of havoc in the region, particularly in Uganda, of course, where it originated, and also in areas of the Democratic Republic of Congo. But what's really amazing about the whole situation is that even Oprah Winfrey at one point appeared to be addressing the crisis caused by the LRA in East Africa. So that may have been in response to the two documentaries you're talking about. But go ahead. What is your assessment of these documentaries and how they analyze the LRA?
It's very interesting, because if you don't know too much about Uganda, they're both very well made documentaries, and they both do address very real, legitimate issues, such as an armed cult like the Lord's Resistance Armies, kidnapping children, committing horrific acts of violence against local people, and so forth. But here's my so I think that both of the documentaries, I think they came from a sincere place. I think the filmmakers were generally concerned about this backward cult leader who was kidnapping Ugandan children, terrorizing people. However, the reason such a cult leader has been able to deceive his followers is because of mass poverty and the hopelessness that comes with it, and the desperation that comes with poverty, especially one as extreme as in Uganda or any place in Africa. And I think the filmmakers themselves were simply naive and didn't realize that they were being used by factions of the State Department who didn't tell them that Yoweri Museveni is backed by the West, that he's a crook himself, that this is a guy that's complicit in the Rwandan massacres, who backed Paul Kagame, who is the real butcher and genocidaire of Rwanda, who continues to rain terror and destruction and plunders and literally rapes Eastern Congo and threatening to overthrow whomever doesn't do his bidding and turns a blind eye to his mass slaughter. Now, Museveni himself is accused of the very things that people charge the LRA. In fact, many of the Christian fascist evangelical churches in the U.S. and Opus Dei, the far-right Catholic Church, and others back Museveni, who is engaging in really horrendous queerphobic policies in Uganda and using the propaganda and discussing anti-queer propaganda that those U.S. Christian fascist movements and the LRA, that they use, and the LRA itself is a Christian cult. But the documentary makers of both Invisible Children and Kony 2012 advocate that the U.S. sent its military to help out this awful government of Museveni, which the West is complicit in propping up because it does the dirty work of Western imperialism, being its proxy in Rwanda and in Congo. And the filmmakers were clearly ignorant of these facts and under the foolish banner of wanting the U.S. and its allies to do good, do humanitarian intervention. So I just think they have good intentions, but are just grossly ignorant and misguided. So Western imperialists were able to manipulate them, which caused a lot of confusion in the audience, who were confused by the reviews and the mixed receptions that African anti-imperialists and anti-Museveni folks and allies to the African solidarity movement were saying, well, folks, hold on, there's a lot of half-truths to all of this, but let's double-check on the solutions being advocated. So I'm curious your response on that before we get to some of the other questions I have.
Yeah, that's why I opposed that whole campaign. It took place around the same time as the Occupy movement in the United States. In fact, the Occupy movement, of course, started in New York, but it spread in September, October of 2011 across the US. There was one here in Detroit that started in October that attracted thousands and thousands of people who occupied a park, a Grand Circus Park downtown, and the city didn't move against them. Well, actually, I wrote the request for the permit for the Occupy Detroit to the law department. And they accepted it for 45 days to allow people to occupy the park, because the way we framed the whole situation was that it was Wall Street that was the real enemy, and that the austerity that was being imposed on people in Detroit at that time, it was really bad in 2011. Housing foreclosures, layoffs, and so forth. So the city did not move against Occupy Detroit. But during that time period, some people came to the Occupy Detroit location. I wasn't there when they came. And apparently they didn't stay that long, but they put posters up on a statue. In fact, the statue of Hazen Pingree, who was considered a progressive governor of Michigan at the turn of the century, during the time of the robber barons and the struggle against monopoly capitalism. So anyway, they put wanted posters for Joseph Kony on Hazen Pingree's statue. Now, a lot of the young people that were involved in the Occupy movement, it was the first thing they had ever done. A lot of them really didn't know a lot about politics, let alone international politics and African affairs. So when I saw this was taking place, I tried to take down those posters that was around the park. And they had used wheat paste or something else, but it was really, really difficult to take down the posters. But they were using this in an attempt to rationalize a U.S. military invasion of Uganda, or perhaps the DRC, to wipe out the LRA. And we've seen this before, where they'll say, well, we're going in to eliminate somebody. For example, the same year, they gave the same rationale for the attacks on Libya. They were saying that Gaddafi was going into Benghazi in the north, and he was going to massacre everybody there. So Barack Obama said, yeah, we have to rush this resolution through the UN Security Council and start bombing Libya. And that's what happened. And it went on for approximately 8 months, constant bombing, then the ground intervention, where they used these rebels who were supposed freedom fighters, but they were actually the same people who the US had labeled as terrorists. So they served as a ground invasion force for NATO and the CIA, while the Pentagon bombed, along with their allies, bombed Libya incessantly for months after month, eventually killing Muammar Gaddafi. So we had already seen that, but there was even confusion in this country in 2011 around what had happened in Libya. Some people thought that the US was justified in doing what it did. You know, there were even people on the so-called left in this country who would not defend Libya, would not defend the Gaddafi government and the Jamahadir. This was clearly a major mistake that was made by the left. They did the same thing involving Syria
exactly.
that year, all the way up until last year when the Syrian government eventually collapsed. So yes,
yeah,
it was clearly a plot, and these plots are still going on as we speak today by demonizing people and using that as a rationale for direct U.S. military intervention. They wanted to do it in Darfur, even before this period, in Western Sudan. So we have to be cautious of this type of propaganda that has gone on now for at least 2 decades.
In fact, this isn't going to be the next country that we cover, but when we cover Nigeria, you know, I remember when there was all this scare stories, and I'm not saying that to you know, shun the stories. Boko Haram
Yes.
was a very, very serious problem, but there was something about Boko Haram and the talks that we need military intervention, that we need to flood the Nigerian government with you know, with U.S. troops and special operations and all of these, you know, pan-European forces. And I thought, and then I was jokingly saying to myself, I bet you Boko Haram is part of Western efforts to deliberately destabilize Nigeria and other parts of Africa, to divide and conquer. And now, many years later, I believe it was Mint Press News or somebody that actually exposed that indeed Boko Haram was actually funded by yours truly, the West. That's why I think people were very right to voice their opposition to the solutions that were being advocated by, I think, in the end of the day, very, very naive, you know, people who simply just did not know all of the complicated facts about who they were propping up as the supposed, you know, knights and white knights, you know, saviors with, you know, Yoweri Museveni. And also, this leads to this question. Now, there was a time Ugandans who were leftists, or certainly left-leaning, were rallying behind, and their international comrades were rallying behind a guy by the name of Bobi Wine, who has done music that is fairly positive and left-leaning and very socially conscious, although borderline, you know, sometimes queer-phobic. He's also done movies that have addressed huge problems Uganda and much of Africa faced. He leads a left-leaning political party, the National Unity Platform, and he was the first serious challenger to Museveni, and he faced huge suppression and more. He was put under house arrest and more. Eventually, he boycotted the elections that and Museveni won. What's your assessment of Wine, and any chance you think he could break the cycle of Museveni's terrible hold on power in Uganda? And if your answer is no, why not? And answer that before I get to these before I get to my 2 last questions. I'm curious here.
Well, I think Bobi Wine, the problem in terms of his image is that he's pro-West or he's backed by the U.S. And I think he did come to the U.S. for medical treatment a couple of years ago after being arrested and tortured in Uganda. So it's not clear to me that he's exactly anti-imperialist or anti-Western. And no, I do not believe.
Would you sort of compare him to Morgan Tsvangirai of the MDC of Zimbabwe?
I'm not sure. I know Tsvangirai was clearly an imperialist agent in my assessment, because the time in which he surfaced and his party, the MDC party, they were heavily funded, by Britain and the United States to overthrow the ZANU-PF government. But they were projected as a legitimate opposition. They were calling strikes in Zimbabwe and so forth during the period around 1999 and 2000 and so forth. When the land reform bill was passed and the land redistribution project was underway. Yeah, but I don't know about Bobi Wine. In terms of him becoming a leader in Uganda, I don't see that happening unless there's some major fracturing within Museveni's party. His son, I understand, is being groomed as a military leader to take over after his father. But then there's been some problems between the two of them. Museveni's son, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's been some problems between the father and the son. But I'm thinking, since economically Uganda has stabilized much more than what it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But at the same time, I'm not sure that Bobi Wine has the political clout to actually take power inside of Uganda. But like I said, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the Museveni government has consolidated power. They appear to be firmly in control of the state there. Unless that changes, unless there's some fracturing inside the government, I don't see Bobi Wine being able to take over in the short term. But who knows? Things can change rapidly.
Interesting. And do you know if there are any other leftist alternatives in Uganda who'd like to unseat Museveni and stop Uganda being a partner in crime with Paul Kagame in both Rwanda and Congo, and want a total break with Western imperialism and engage in constructive and in a more leftist manner with BRICS in Latin America? And in fact, important notes, as you mentioned, there was a documentary about Bobi Wine that was fairly positive about him, but as you mentioned, Bobi Wine has some imperialist skeletons in his closet, and he was on a web event with Juan Guaido and falsely linking up with him and saying that they had the same cause, which couldn't be further from the truth. And while Museveni is viciously queerphobic, as I mentioned, Wine himself also isn't very queer-friendly either in his music, but very obvious that he has some imperial blind spots himself. I'm curious your response.
Yeah, I don't think, I don't know of any leftist group that's formidable to generate support, political support, or rebellion, for example, against the Museveni government. There were discussions last year about having demonstrations about the economic and social conditions in Uganda, but they were quickly shut down. So in that regard, I'm not sure that any party at this point is in a position to make a formidable challenge against the National Resistance Party in Uganda. And you also mentioned the fact that Bobi Wine had made statements in terms of the opposition in Venezuela, which was clearly supported by U.S. imperialism to the hilt. Nonetheless, they failed.
And also clearly far right, and he's a guy who positions himself as as a leftist.
Mm-hmm. So that's a clear indication that Wine is being supported by the West, and because Museveni's rhetoric, for example, is anti-West now, and he has not gone along with some things that the West has advocated. So yes, very well, they could be involved in a plot to have him removed, but whether or not Bobi Wine can do it remains open to question. But yes, These are some of the problems that we're facing on the African continent in terms of the efforts on the part of other opposition parties on the continent. They always have to look out for the role of the United States and Britain and the European Union to co-opt their movements and for the benefit of imperialism. And some people are very opportunistic. They're willing to do that. Riley Odinga in Kenya is one of them. He, of course, was the darling of the West in the elections of 2013, and again during the elections of 2017, the whole 2018, the whole controversy over who won the elections, whether it was Kenyatta or whether it was Riley Odinga, which is like a second generational conflict. So we have to look at these countries independently, but with an overall thrust of recognizing that the U.S., even though they may use people over a period of time, can grow weary of those people, particularly if those people don't want to follow their dictates exclusively. So they will fund opposition groups to try to overthrow them or have them removed in an electoral setting.
In fact, it's also not unprecedented that the U.S. supports two different sides of a very conflict. So the U.S. was all great with the current Ethiopian government, and then out of nowhere decides to support the Tigray secessionist forces. And we know, it was, and of course, one of the biggest scandals about the whole Iran-Contra affair was that the U.S. was supporting Iraq in its efforts to overthrow and destroy the Islamic Republic of Iran, and yet behind the scenes were selling arms for hostages. So again, it's not unprecedented
Yes.
that the U.S. will also support all different sides of a conflict because the U.S., Britain, Canada, France, and its allies thrive upon Africa being unstable, so that they can much more easily manipulate the situation and get whatever cheap resources off of the continent.
Exactly. And the TPLF in Ethiopia is or has been the stepfather, so to speak, of their organization, because it was during the period that Meles Zenawi was in office initially that they intervened in Somalia. They got involved in all kinds of different pro-U.S. military operations in the Horn of Africa and East Africa. Yes, so it wasn't surprising that when the problems erupted in 2000, 2001 in the Tigray region, that they brought Herman Cohen, who was the U.S. Undersecretary for African Affairs under the first Bush administration, that intervened in 1991 in London and told the TPLF, the EPRDF, to go into Addis Ababa to take control of the government there. So they have been historic allies of the TPLF for decades. That is U.S. imperialism. So that is why they took a position against the Abiy Ahmed government, which came to power as a result of a national uprising in Ethiopia in 2018. So yeah, they can play both sides. They can be your friend today and be your worst enemy tomorrow. That's why Trump, is able to fool some people into believing that he wants to end the war in Ukraine, or conning people into believing that he's good friends with the Russian Federation leadership.
Yeah.
Well, if that was the case, why has there not been a ceasefire in Ukraine since he's taking office on January 20th? And he mentioned last week he was very angry with the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin because they won't accept his terms for the settlement of the situation in Ukraine. So now he's on this trade war kick, and that's destroying jobs, institutions, not only in the United States, but all over the world. So people are not talking about the Ukraine war as much now as they are about the impact of the U.S. tariff war. So you're right. They will switch sides at the drop of a hat. We saw in terms of Uganda, this fits in perfectly because, it was them, the imperialists and the Zionists, that overthrew Milton Obote in 1971.
Exactly.
And Amin asked them for weapons. They refused, so he switched sides and tried to go with the Libyans, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and others. So it's a very complicated situation, and people have to read, they have to study, they have to analyze almost on a daily basis to keep track of what's going on in these various African states.
So, all right. So let me try to do this again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Last question. Yeah.
So regarding Uganda and the continent of Africa in general, what advice would you give to the queer community in the U.S. who are rightly concerned about anti-queer oppression in places like Uganda and even elsewhere in African West Asia, and they rightly have legitimate concerns and grievances about the heteronormative and gender-conformist regime, but we know that Western imperialists often co-opt noble people power movements like the feminist one and queer liberationist one, and under the veil and promise of women's liberation and queer liberation, they advance violent imperialism and a regime which doesn't even and then prop up a regime which doesn't even address the problems of patriarchy and heteronormativity. In fact, it makes the situation worse depending who the West props up. So how does one help our African queer brothers and sisters in the non-binary living under extreme patriarchy and heteronormativity without advancing femonationalism, queer nationalism, homonationalism, imperialism in a nutshell? I'm curious your response to that.
Well, that's a very, very good question. And as you said, the way you framed it is that they can co-opt these movements to become pro-imperialist, pro-West. And we've seen that happening. But I think like the Uganda government, for example, and the government in Ghana is another example. I think they're making an extreme mistake, by targeting people from the LGBTQ AI plus community. The main enemy is imperialism, which is a reason behind the poverty, the lack of food, the lack of technological developments. That is the real enemy. And I think it's not really solving the problem by emphasizing that there are people in society who are not accepting the traditional nuclear family and so forth that has been advocated by the West. I also believe that the right-wing Christian movement in this country is working with some of these elements in Africa against gay and lesbian and transgender people to undermine their communities, but at the same time to influence these governments to take these positions, to pass bills outlawing people's lifestyles. At the same time, they're not doing hardly anything against imperialism and imperialist influence. So I think it's a serious mistake when these governments target people within their own countries for vilification and for persecution and even prosecution. So there have been people who have lost their lives as a result of this rhetoric, but I believe very strongly that the West is behind a lot of this homophobic propaganda and policies that are taking place in Africa, because it's a way of dividing the society, and at the same time, it's a way of making inroads for the evangelicals and other right-wing Christians to get into Africa to influence politics even broader than in terms of sexual or gender politics. So I think it's, as you said, the way you framed it, you have to be against this type of blatant discrimination and oppression, but at the same time, it has to be done in a way that it's not supporting imperialism and its advance on the African continent. And that's the way it's being promoted right now. I believe very, very strongly that the right-wing Christian community, which is in alliance with the current Trump administration, is fostering a lot of this discontent that's taking place on the African continent.
Fascinating. And then as we wrap up, I have to ask this question, which is unrelated to Uganda, but it's about it's about the situation in Sudan. What's North Sudan. So what's going on right now? Because apparently hostilities in that civil war are ending, and I'm curious if there's any updates you can give us about what's happening in Sudan, and are we finally going to see peace break out in that particular part of Sudan as well as South Sudan? I'm curious your response.
Well, there have been advances made by the Sudanese armed forces. They've retaken the capital, the presidential palace, which is in the capital, and other areas of the country. But the war itself, there's no resolution at this point. And the Sudanese government took the United Arab Emirates before the UN just a few days ago, saying that the UAE is supporting the Rapid Support Forces, which is the militia group, which is a part of the Sudanese armed forces. But those two factions of the armed forces are the reason why we have this type of military civil war that's going on inside of Sudan. The second anniversary is coming up on April the 15th of the outbreak of this war, but it's by no means over. In South Sudan, for example, the rival of the Salva Kiir government, Riek Machar, was placed under house arrest last week because of the tensions within the SPLM. So yes, the situation is very volatile. It's very tense in both the Republic of Sudan and the Republic of South Sudan. And of course, they've had refugees that have fled both countries into Uganda. So the Ugandan government definitely has a reason for trying to bring peace and stability to both the Republic of Sudan as well as the Republic of South Sudan.
Is there any evidence that because I know in a lot of the Palestine solidarity protests,
yes,
there's often people who say, who link what's going on in Palestine to Congo DRC, Haiti, West Papua, and they'll often mention Sudan, in those demonstrations to say that, places like Sudan, Congo, Haiti, Palestine, we're all victims of Western imperialism. But when it comes to the civil war, this war between these different factions in the army, is the West supporting all of is the West supporting all of the different sides, and therefore because there seems to be a lot of confusion as to what should be the best way, what should solidarity people, anti-imperialists, what should be the best way forward in their advocacy apart from stop the hostilities, stop the war, period. I'm curious your response.
Yes, and I think the main issue is the necessity of developing a revolutionary democratic government in the Republic of Sudan. That process has been disrupted as a result of not only the obstructionist policies of the Sudanese army, but also the outbreak of the conflict between the Rapid Support Forces and the Sudanese armed forces. So there definitely has to be peace between those two different military factions. But at the same time, we have to promote and be in solidarity with the civilian and popular democratic movement that arose beginning in late 2018 and early 2019 against the military government in the Republic of Sudan. I don't believe that you can have democracy under a military regime. And until those two factions of the military are able to resolve their differences, there won't be any democratic transition in the Republic of Sudan. And much of that holds true for the Republic of South Sudan as well, because they have not had multi-party democratic elections since they became independent in 2011 because of the split within the SPLM. So both countries, which at one point were united prior to 2011 need to come back together again, even in a federated system. But in order to do that, there has to be peace among the major factions, dominant military and political factions in both countries.
Well, here's hoping cooler heads prevail and that's able to be advanced. Well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1, our All Things Africa edition, All Things Uganda edition with Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan-African Newswire, of which he is editor and a contributor, as well as a frequent contributor to Black Agenda Reports. Please check out his work and donate generously to his work, buy his books, and donate to BAR generously. And also, please donate to 1+1 and share all of 1+1's work, past and present, and donate, help our audience grow by liking and sharing. And join us next time, where we will be exploring the Congo, Zaire, the fake DRC. So join Abayomi and me as we continue to explore the continent of Africa, its history, past and present, and current affairs. Have a great weekend, everyone. Good night and good luck. Power to the people. Death to Western imperialism. All my best. And I just want to also dedicate this episode to Teo Ficarelli and Bianca Mugeni, who is a Ugandan Canadian and so forth. So this episode is especially dedicated to her, and people should get Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and Bianca's husband, Yves Engler, his book, Canada and Africa, 300 Years in Exploitation. Until then, all my best, folks, and keep up the good fight.